episode of Fair Trade Unplugged, where we're bringing you news and views and stories from the world of fair trade. Now, this week I've got a very special guest who I know very well, but got a fascinating story and is also one of the originators in the UK of the Fairmade concept that we've talked about quite a lot on We Are Fair Trade, and you'll have seen it elsewhere. So let me introduce you to Jamie MacAlistair. Morning, Jamie.
Good morning.
Good to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, likewise, yeah.
So, Jamie, you've got an interesting background, interesting story, and I keep finding out more little snippets of it the more we talk. But you've definitely got an African heart. So tell us a little bit about how did you come to be connected with Africa and what happened?
Right, okay. Well, depending on how far back you want to go, I got involved initially with trips to Uganda through an organization called Transformational Business Networks, where a group of us went out to support entrepreneurs through a local church. And then following on from that, I met a guy from YWAM who had a connection with a university in Uganda, wanted someone to come and help set up a business faculty. He asked me if I knew anything about business schools, and I'd just been working at a business school for a while. I said, yes, I do, and I'd be very happy to come out and help. So we went out to live in Uganda for about 18 months back in 2017. And that's what started off, if you like, the love affair with Africa.
So I've traveled to many countries, which has been fascinating, but I haven't fallen in love with them in the way that you seem to have done with Africa. So I understand, okay, you were out there and you had a purpose, but what was it that really sort of stuck in your heart that's caused this long-term relationship that you have?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons for the business school that I was involved in setting up was trying to create practical business skills which would help the people of Uganda, essentially. But what I discovered, and also through a connection with an agribusiness guy we met there, that actually one thing that would really help Uganda and Africa more generally is if we could create demand for value-added products. There's products that are not just sourced in Africa, which has been going on for hundreds of years, but products which are actually manufactured in Africa as well. And so that started the idea of setting up a business which could import those value-added products.
So what's the advantage then? So as you say, ingredients are being bought from Africa for hundreds of years, but when you say value added, what adds the value? What's the difference?
So essentially, at its simplest, if you take something like cocoa, the majority of cocoa is exported from Africa in raw form. What we're talking about is creating businesses which take the cocoa and add all the other ingredients to end up with a bar of chocolate, which creates jobs locally and helps the local economy. And there's a knock-on effect throughout the economy.
So why doesn't that happen anyway? I mean, it seems obvious, every country wants to exploit its own resources, but why isn't that already happening, or why has it not been happening already?
That's quite a deep question. I think you've got now, particularly in the market like cocoa and other similar products, you've got established supply chains. You've got big companies like big chocolate manufacturers that have made it their business to source cocoa at lean prices, if you like. And then manufacture, and they need economies of scale, so they need to have centers of manufacturing which give them that. So it's quite a difficult market to penetrate in many ways for sort of local African suppliers.
Because presumably to make money out of chocolate, since that's the example we're using, you've got to produce vast amounts of chocolate, haven't you, to make serious profit. So what has if we take Europe as an example, since that's where we're based, what have we got that people in Africa have not got that means we can scale and people in Africa can't?
Well, I suppose they're partly we're closest to the biggest market. The main people who are buying chocolate at higher prices are in the West, as opposed to in Africa, although that's changing as we go. And therefore, you've got the volume demand, if you like, in those markets. And the investment's gone into those markets. So you've got investment in automation, which has tended to be much more difficult to source in places like Africa.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So certainly the technology aspect is part of it, having a big market right on your doorstep. So are we saying then that even though cocoa is grown largely in Africa and parts of South America as well, I know, but the people growing up next to the cocoa farms are not eating chocolate themselves?
Not absolutely, not nearly as much. Although that is starting to change, and that's one of the things that needs to change for this value add manufacturing to really work.
Yeah.
There's a kind of a circular argument, if you like. The more that you create wealth in these markets, the more they're able to afford higher value products themselves, and therefore you continue to create demand for the local manufacturer.
And before you went to Africa, did you have this idea in your head about, look, value-added products where we make the whole thing as close to the original ingredients as possible? Was that something you were carrying, or was that something that was born in you when you were in Africa? How did that happen?
No, it's very much born in me in Africa. So we worked quite closely with an agribusiness connected with the university, based in a place called Ginger, which is at the source of the Nile, who grow all sorts of fruit products, basically through trees. And they have a vision to plant 1 billion trees. So they've got quite a big-minded mission, if you like.
Yeah.
But the issue that they have was creating demand for the products. So we said, well, actually, part of the key to this is going to be creating export demand. The problem with shipping sort of big chunky fruits across to Europe is that it's not economic to do that often. You do it with some things like avocados, for example, but in most cases you can't do that. So you need to process it anyway. So the story then developed so how do we process this product? How do we package it so that it travels better? And then we got on to the whole idea. So how does that actually creates more jobs? So it became a sort of self-fulfilling discussion, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. It is such a simple idea, isn't it? But when you first introduced me to the idea of Fairmade, it was like an instant aha moment for me. Thinking, well, but of course, that makes perfect sense. But it had never occurred to me, and probably would not have occurred to me, I say, to my own shame. But it was only because you started talking about it, and it's just like I was an instant convert, because it just makes so much more sense. But it's funny, isn't it, how sometimes the blindingly obvious turns out not to be blindingly obvious to, I don't know if it's a intelligence thing on my part or what, but certainly it's such a neat idea if we can make it work, that to keep the jobs near the source ingredient, that makes beautiful sense.
Yes, indeed. That's the challenge, yeah.
Obviously, I've traveled most of the world, and I would often open my sessions with a sort of semi-joking apology, because the British have been to most parts of the world, haven't they? And sometimes that's been more positive than in other places, shall we say. So did you find any of that, obviously going back to Africa, where we had significant control for a long time? Did that turn out to be an issue at all for you?
It's very interesting. Yes, obviously Uganda is a former British colony, as a lot of East Africa and South Africa, and at the time, no, it wasn't an issue. But I was exposed in a recent conference to a speaker talking about the legacy, if you like, of the empire. And obviously the British Empire, I think they did do some good things, but there were a lot of things which we're probably not particularly proud of, slavery arguably being one of them. And he's talking about how do we make restitution? Is there a case for making restitution for things like slavery? And of course, there's some strong arguments for that. And the question came out, well, what's the most useful way to make restitution for some of the wrongs, if you like, of the empire? And we come back to this legacy. I see it's a legacy of empire. You can argue a lot of non-empire or parts of the West are also involved, which is that we still exploit arguably African countries like Uganda from an economic perspective, even though they're no longer politically oppressed. We are still getting our products from them at rock bottom prices.
When greed became the main driver of capitalism, which it wasn't necessarily at the beginning, and you could even argue that as the constraining effects of faith or religion fell away, capitalism became more and more greed-based. So we pillage wherever we can pillage and make vast amounts of money. But since people still have a conscience, then the guilt kicks in and we start making charitable donations back to the places that we've pillaged. Of course, that kind of charity can turn toxic very quickly if it's not exercised properly, because it takes away dignity and it causes dependence. So it would be much, much better just not to pillage in the first place, because then this sort of pillage and guilt mechanism wouldn't have to keep operating. And I think when I first heard from you about Fairmade, that seems like, well, let's just make it fair from the beginning, and then we're not having to make these knee-jerk charitable reactions to try and redress the balance of unfairness that we've caused. So the idea of doing that in a business context seems appealing. The trouble is, presumably, people who are trying to operate on a fair basis are up against big industry that is not operating on a fair basis. So how do we ever compete in the Western market when we're up against people paying much, much less for their ingredients than we are?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. Going back to your point about capitalism, I mean, there are a lot of advantage. You can see the beauty to some extent of a capitalist system, which tends to try and maximize efficiency across the supply chain, if you like.
Yeah.
But I was a management consultant for about 20 years. And one of the big mantras we talked about in sort of consulting to businesses was the idea that the customer is king, which makes some sense. The problem with that is, what does that say for the supplier, if you like, or the people whose jobs are dependent? If everything is focused on the customer, and that's basically what's happened with world trade, if you think about it, that a lot of the customers in world trade tend to be in the wealthier West, or the wealthier, the North, as you call it, prosperous North. And a lot of the suppliers now tend to be in the South. So we've got this kind of mismatch between the producers of work, if you like, and the customer, who gets a great deal basically from a lot of stuff that's traded. So how do you change that? Gradually, I guess, changing mindsets and helping people to realize that actually getting stuff at the rock bottom prices at the expense of people's livelihoods and is not perhaps a great thing to do. And there is clearly a movement with fair trade, with a number of businesses that try to do things in a more ethical way, that people are starting to buy more products from. But it's a long process.
We're selling products that are not as cheap as the non-fair alternative. That's our big disadvantage. And yet people are willing to take that hit in order to help people. But then when times are difficult, it's like, well, do I want to put food on my own children's table, or do I want to put food on the table of a family that I'll never meet? You know, and you hit this point where they're saying, I'd love to help, but I feel like I can't afford it. So what would you say to people there? How do we encourage people to say, okay, but let's not give up on this, even though the economy's not great? What is the real benefit to people of colluding with us or collaborating with us in this attempt to buy and sell more fairly?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just kind of picking up on your story about how people's going to start giving and then you can't stop them. That's been to a large extent my experience with the trading business that we're involved in, particularly with the retailers and with some of the consumers we sell to directly. Is once people have got the story and understood it, they become very loyal. But it's right. It's just getting past that initial point, and they're loyal. They're recognizing that there is a premium to be paid at this stage. So, yeah, it's how do you get that message across? Yeah, there's a sacrifice to be made to be able to support this cause. It's in lieu of giving. How do you get the message that this is not? It's a form of giving almost. But actually it's in a more helpful form of giving because you're actually creating something which is sustainable and scalable. That once people are buying these products, they're continuing to fund the jobs in these developing countries. So, yeah, it's a tough message, but it's getting through gradually, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that excited me about it is if I'm buying fair trade, fairly traded, or Fairmade, which we'll talk about in a moment, there's no question mark over, but is this really going to the target people that we're trying to help? Because it's a commercial connection, you know for a fact that the extra bit that you're paying is directly benefiting those people because it's an economic process. Whereas with charities, having run several of those myself, the question you're always having to answer is, but will my donation really actually get to the target audience or the target place? And how much is being taken off the top for admin and all of those things. But if we're trading with people who are manufacturing where the ingredients are grown, it's clear that by just readjusting my shopping budget a little bit, I get the certainty that I really am helping people in Uganda or Madagascar or Ghana or Mozambique or wherever that might be. So I think that's an advantage we've got. And like you say, we're not asking you to just give money away. We're just asking you to spend a tiny bit more on your shopping, knowing that will make a major difference to people in the global south.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's this whole idea of trade, not aid, which is part of fair trade as well as Fairmade. It's kind of gathering momentum. There's a famous professor, Harvard professor, Michael Porter, who is famous because he basically wrote the book that you use at business schools on strategy called Competitive Strategy. And he's got a great TED talk on why business is the best way of solving social problems. And he's a great speaker, so it's very well worth having a look. But the essence of what he says is, actually, if you think 70% of resources, money, if you like, are invested in business as opposed to something like 10% in charity and maybe another 20% in the public sector. So most of the money that's sloshing around is in business. And if you can tap into that, and if you've got a business that's making a profit, it's therefore sustainable. You don't suddenly run out when you say, well, we don't want to give to this cause anymore. And what's more, not only is it sustainable, but if you keep doing it, you keep growing it, you keep reinvesting it, you can actually solve even more and more of the problems. So it's what he calls scalable. You can grow.
Yeah, that's key, isn't it? Absolutely key. Yeah, and I suppose that links back as well, doesn't it? That we need to keep growing the market, because the big disadvantage of making things in the source country is we'll get wiped out by people who are paying low for their ingredients and selling high in the west, the north. So the more we can grow the market for fair trade, fairly traded, ethically traded products, the more they can achieve economies of scale, and that makes their business much more robust, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a very good point. I mean, coming back to your point about price being higher, of course, that is partly because of the economies of scale argument, like you say.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, Africa's been kind of left behind compared to other developing countries like the Far East. And what's been the key for the Far East has been exports. China has gone from rags to riches based on exporting value-added products. And they famously are able to do it and achieve it by offering lower prices than can be achieved in the West. So you kind of ask your question, why can't you do the same in Africa? And I think it's a good challenge, but it's that investment in and the time that's needed to build up the economy of a scale that you need to make it happen. But eventually, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be able to manufacture bars of chocolate and packets of cashew nuts as we trade at competitive prices out of Africa.
Yeah, for sure. I've been a keen motorcyclist my entire life. I've been riding motorbikes since I was 17. And when I was early on in my motorbiking career, everybody was laughing at Japanese motorbikes. Oh, all cars for that matter, they fall apart and they're not reliable. Whereas now it's the complete opposite, that now if you want an uber reliable car or motorbike, you buy Japanese. But what's shocking is the Chinese motorcycle industry is pushing out unbelievably good bikes and cars at unbelievably low prices. And Tim Cook from Apple was being interviewed a while back, and he said, look, everybody thinks we make the iPhone in China because it's cheap. And he said it certainly was the case. He said, but now we build them over there because they have more micro engineers than any other nation on earth. So everybody laughed at them. They were cheap and cheerful, but they've stuck at it. And slowly technology has ramped up. The people skills have ramped up where they're a technology powerhouse. Now it's become a bit political because other countries don't like the competition, but that's just an economic argument. But what if Africa became a major technology manufacturing powerhouse? There's no actual reason why that couldn't happen. It is just, how do we get the flywheel turning fast enough? It seems crazy talking here right now today, but that's what everybody said about Japan and China and Korea, all of whom are major manufacturing powerhouses now. So it feels crazy, but I kind of like that it just seems so improbable, but we've got good precedent for the improbable turning into the commonplace, haven't we?
I think that's right. I'd also add, though, that I think what is even more likely is that Africa becomes a powerhouse for manufactured food products.
Yes, yeah.
And the reason I say that is because it's often being coined as the kind of the breadbasket of the world. Ultimately, I think some consultants called McKinsey did a report a few years back, basically said that 60% of unused arable land is still in Africa.
Wow.
And the potential there, and it's by the way, a much bigger continent than it looks on a map because of the way that the global spherical geometry works. But it's a huge continent, massive potential for providing food products.
And that's interesting because you've mentioned that you're at this conference and talk about reparations for the how do we describe it? The negative impact of being part of the British Empire or one of the other empires. And I think I understand the motivation for that, but I think it's much easier to do good when you're motivated by something positive. So I think the sort of guilt-based underpinnings of saying, oh, well, we should make reparations, and who do you make them to, and how do you do that, and who's the most deserving? But to say, well, rather than that, or maybe it can happen as well as that, but I'm much more interested in saying, okay, let's go back with an empire of grace. If you shouldn't use the word empire, it triggers people, but But what if we went back on a mission of grace instead of a mission of pillage, where to say, listen, we have technological know-how that at the moment you don't have. We have a market that at the moment you don't have. But what if we came there and said, look, let's do everything we can to enable you with all your national pride intact, with all the dignity intact. Say, look, we'll just work with you and say, look, how do we get that breadbasket to start to flourish even more than it already is? They don't lack people, they don't lack intelligence, they don't lack drive, they don't lack motivation. They just need a break, like we needed a break. It was just so long ago that we've forgotten it. That I really like, because you just think then it's motivated positively. It's motivated by things that, as a Christian, sit well with me and are fundamental to my belief system, and it can economically benefit people, and then they get the credit, rightfully so, because they'll have done it themselves. They just need a bunk up, don't they?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, as you're talking to me, taking me back to my kind of first trip to Uganda. And I went with this impression of a country, a continent, if you like, that's desperately in need of help, is like a big black hole that you pour money into and none of it ever comes back out again. My very first impression right from the beginning was nothing could be further from the truth. I know it's not true necessarily of all of Africa, but certainly Uganda is this incredibly fertile country, beautiful people, very friendly people, has so much to offer the rest of the world. And yet that's not the way we see it. So, yeah. You've hit that on the head there.
It's good to be reminded, isn't it? Because as we're out there writing our emails and advertising cashew nuts and chocolate and dried fruit, it can feel like, oh my goodness, this is just so hard and so slow. But the potential is enormous, isn't it? So as things have gone on, this has sort of coalesced, hasn't it, into the Fairmade concept. So just tell us a little bit about how did that happen? Why are you using that term? What's the value of that term at the moment?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So when I initially started the import business, which is called African Kingdom in the UK, I was not aware of Fairmade as a concept. But our mission was exactly what Fairmade is all about. And I then met Brett Beach, who set up a website called Fairmade, based primarily on African manufacturers. The concept was exactly what we've been talking about. And we kind of teamed up, and I said, well, look, you're promoting a concept which we're actually putting into action here in the UK by importing these products. We need to get together. So our first opportunity to do that was at a trade show last year, where we put together 4 Fairmade manufacturers and promoted them at the NEC in April of last year. And we've kind of gone from there.
Exciting. So if something is eligible to be described as fair made, and a customer sees that, what is that telling the customer? What does it actually mean that a product is fair made?
It basically, in its simplest sense, just means that the product has been manufactured and packaged, consumer packaged, if you like, in the source country, creating the local jobs, as we've talked about. There is now, we've just gone through a process of getting the trademark, it's a group trademark, registered, and in doing that we also need to set up processes for checking that everything's kind of working ethically in the company. So we have an application form which does look at other things like how people are being treated, whether suppliers are being paid the fair price, environmental factors, etc. But the main part of the story is that the manufacturing is happening in the source country.
And just for clarity, the source country, that's the source country of the primary ingredient, presumably.
Exactly. Yeah. We talk about the main one. We think particularly about Africa. The main ones are things like cocoa, coffee, tea, Cashew nuts, 50% of the world's cashew nuts actually come from Africa, even though a lot of them get sent to Asia to be processed at the moment. So yeah, those kind of products.
Okay. So there's a group trademark for the word Fairmade. I think I've seen a logo on some literature. So there's a logo and a word trademark. So who owns that then? Is that you or?
Okay, so yeah, good question. One of the things we did following the trade show is we set up and as we were applying for the trademark, we had to set up a social enterprise, but it's limited by guarantee. So there are no profits or dividends back to shareholders. So it's effectively like a charity, but a trading charity. It's called a community interest company. And at the moment, there are 3 directors of that CIC, and I'm one of those. Brett is another one, and Evans, who you also mentioned, is the 3rd director.
Right. So what's the vision for then this organization? Where do you see that going? What could come of it? What are the needs?
So our primary purpose is to promote Fairmade as a concept, and to support the suppliers who are registered Fairmade companies in developing countries. And the primary support is promoting the concept and effectively providing marketing and demand, if you like, for their products. But also there's a vision that we would, there may be other ways that we can support suppliers as well. And ultimately, I mean, the primary objective of Fairmade is to alleviate poverty in these countries in this way.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, I just happen to know because I was reading an article, but there are 450 ethical logos of various kinds. So if you go into supermarkets, you could be looking at up to 450. Some of them are much better known than others. Obviously, the Fair Trade logo, that's by far and away the most recognized of all of them. But there's a vast array of them now emphasizing different things. So why do we need the 450 first? What's Fairmade doing that these others are not doing?
Well, obviously we think these are all great. The Fair Trade has done a great job pioneering that concept. But we think this is a natural evolution, if you like, a progression from Fair Trade. In fact, a number of people that I've spoken to who have been involved in Fair Trade businesses have said, actually, the next stage is actually to support local value addition, as it is called, in developing countries. That kind of takes us to the next level. And at the moment, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any trademark or any brand that's particularly promoting that as a concept.
Yeah. So yeah, I haven't seen either. And there are so many levers, aren't there? In any commercial business, there's price, there's fairness, there's avoiding certain ingredients, there's how are the people treated, how is the land itself treated, and a lot of these logos will tend to emphasize one thing. But as you're saying, the key thing about Fairmade is this is people taking ingredients that they or their neighbors have grown and then doing the manufacturing processes, the packaging, all at source, so that all those profit margins stay in the source country. Very interesting. Well, I think it's brilliant. I'm bought into this in a big way, and people who are on the website will see a number of products, some of which we're buying from you, like the cashew nuts, the sunshine nuts, and made in Africa chocolate, and hopefully more fruit-based products to come. So I think it's fantastic what you're doing, Jamie. I just wish you all the very best with it, and long may it continue and may it prosper.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's great working with you as well. Thank you.